Hey, welcome back to E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, how's it going today?
I'm doing great. I mean, Travis and Taylor getting married, what could be better than that?
I know. What news? Pretty crazy. Today on E-commerce on Tap, we've got some different news. We're covering Medik8, which is, really this fascinating story of a, brand started in Europe that has expanded in the US and ended up with a pretty incredible acquisition. But before we dive into their story covering, the founding story, the supply chain, the exit, the growth, etc. Aaron, do you want to give a quick overview for those joining for the first time what E-commerce on Tap is?
Absolutely. So every episode, Nathan and I take a well-known D2C company. We tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and talk about their exit potential.
Yeah, and this season we've been covering, skincare, beauty brands, and I just feel like there's so many exits in this industry, and the multiples kind of remind me of like SaaS multiples. I mean, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, like if you're just thinking about where to start a business, skincare is not a terrible place to be.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm just curious, were there any tidbits that caught your eye this past week before we dive in?
Yeah, there were two. I've been studying partnerships a lot the last couple of weeks, and Ulta and Target have announced that they're going to break up in 2026. And so if you have been in a Target, you know that there's been like these end caps that kind of look like Ulta, the store and store sort of thing. And that partnership did not work out at all. And meanwhile, you look at Kohl's and Sephora, which were struck at roughly the same time, they're doing about $1 billion in sales together, and they're doubling down on that. And so it's just really interesting to kind of look at the differences between why one succeeded, why one failed, and I wrote about it on the blog if people want to look at it. But then the other one was Hertz is going to start selling used cars on Amazon, which I thought was just kind of funny.
Yeah, that is funny. I mean, I don't think about buying a car on Amazon, but I guess now maybe I will. We'll see what deals they have. For me, I've been following AG1. We discussed briefly before recording grunts and their growth and just how they're really kind of eating AG1's lunch. But AG1 has now expanded into a sleep support supplement that they're calling AGZ. I actually like the name. I think it's kind of neat because they have
Clever.
AG, AGZ. And it's just this nighttime drink that comes in three flavors. You've got mixed berry, mint chocolate, and chocolate. And it's formulated with, active ingredients like ashwagandha and a few others that, I think are pretty notable. And, the product is melatonin free, which I think is a huge plus. And so we'll see. Sleep is obviously a huge category, a growing problem here in the US. And I think it was about time that AG1 really branched into a new product category.
Yeah, it's interesting because they have had one SKU forever. And so here they went from one SKU to four. And so that's kind of a bit of a change for them, but I think it's something that they needed to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I already know your, morning routine with your skincare routine. I know you've got this process you've been doing since you were in elementary school, Aaron. But for those that, don't have a routine, what I think has really been fascinating for me with these skincare brands is the best ones really build habits that stick, right? And so Medik8, really kind of came up with this clever CSA type of habit. And so C stands for vitamin C in the morning, S stands for sunscreen by day, and A stands for vitamin A at night. And so, I mean, I think that's kind of been a core theme when we look at these beauty brands is they try to instill a habit across their consumers that really, I think, drives retention, right?
Yeah, CSA, we'll kind of get into the origins of this, but basically all of this research that has been done about what works, what doesn't work, they boil it down to just three simple letters. And that has really been the framework that they've built their company around. And they've done more than just simplifying skincare. They've also rejected this false choice between you have to be clean and ethical or have science and clinical backing for what you're doing. And so I'm really excited to dive into this story and just talk about kind of where they were started, how they grew, and then ultimately, the exit that they had.
Yeah. And so who is our founder here?
Yeah, so our main founder is Elliot Isaacs, and he's a UK-based scientist who earned degrees in physiology, pharmacology, and biochemistry. Just a three major kind of guy from the University of Leeds. And after earning these degrees, rather than putting them all to work, he decided to take a 4-year-long backpacking trip through Asia. And so I think that might be a European thing where you get 3 degrees, you say, you know what, I don't actually want to do this. I'm going to go walk around in Asia for a while.
Yeah, this global exploration really reminds me of Anita Roddick, who was the founder of the Body Shop, and they were really a trailblazer in this ethical beauty category. So they launched in 1976. They were the first to ban animal testing. They embraced natural products, and they really championed this fair trade sourcing. And I think Elliot's kind of exploration across Asia gave him a firsthand view of these diverse skincare philosophies. You think the traditional herbal remedies, maybe he experienced some of K beauty that we covered on a previous episode. And I think it gave him a broader worldview about, business and ethics, and really influenced his vision for a skincare brand that could merge science and values. And I think he recognized this striking gap in the market, that brands, really either offered this luxury without ethics or ethics without effectiveness. And so he came to envision a skincare brand that blended both, luxury, ethical, and science-backed approaches. And, he kind of mentions he was inspired by Anita Roddick, and, he wanted more than just, natural beauty here. And I think he saw frustration in consumers that these ethical brands felt a bit too gentle and clinical brands felt a bit too harsh. I think, what's interesting to me is that historically speaking, it seems like brands either had to choose between being science first or being ethics first. And, what they're basically saying here is that this is a false choice and the gap wasn't really necessary.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We as we were doing research, we kind of made a little graph between people who have an ethical commitment or really lean into sustainability or transparency or cruelty-free as part of their values for their brand, and other brands that lean more into the clinical efficacy. And in the quadrant where people are leaning more into the efficacy, you've got brands like SkinCeuticals or Murad or maybe The Ordinary. And down on the ones that just lean into the ethical piece, you've got the Body Shop, Lush, things like that. And so, these ethical brands really have, these strong values that are inherent in their marketing, inherent in how they talk about things, but they're somewhat light on any hardcore anti-aging results, if that was what you're going for. In these clinical ones, they tend to be much more medicalized. They're a little bit cold, they're higher prices, and they can be a little bit intimidating for the average consumer. And so, consumers were inadvertently being told, you have to choose your side. Do you want values or do you want actual results? And I think what Medik8 did so well is they asked, why not both? And so they're a vegan, cruelty-free, B Corp certified company. So they've got all the value stuff there. But then they've also have clinical grade actives, stabilized vitamin C, peptides, and just very consumer-friendly language and pricing. And so that's really the thought that they had there.
Yeah, and so after he returned to Asia, he didn't necessarily just dive straight into skincare, right? He actually took a pretty scientific approach here. He reviewed dermatological research, which, goes above and beyond my head, but, there was a ton of kind of journals in the British Library, and he learned which ingredients had really been clinically backed versus ones that were kind of just, these luxury type of ingredients. And so he narrowed his research into 3 highly effective components: vitamin C, sunscreen, and vitamin A, the retinoids. And so that's kind of where the CSA really stems from. And this led to the formation of Medik8 in 2009. And I think to loop this in with his family, his father ran a pharmacy that was lovingly dubbed The Shed. And so he really got to begin this hands-on formulation in that pharmacy and kind of took this instability and irritation of retinoids and developed the Retinol 3TR, which was a waterless, gentle, yet potent version designed to minimize irritation. And so he continued to experiment and settle on this framework that would shape Medik8. And this was really their core CSA philosophy and became the framework to guide the whole brand. And so their first product was Retinol 3TR, and that launched in 2009. And it really was an immediate hit, so much that, customers reportedly queued around the block to purchase it. And shortly after, he followed with a C tetra vitamin C serum, which was an SPF 30 sunscreen, really completing the CSA product trio.
Why do you think that simple frameworks like CSA or AG1's One Scoop a Day resonate so strongly with consumers?
So, I mean, it's a good question. I think across categories, you have different habits that get instilled across consumers. And I think people kind of in general, they have their kind of supplement routine, they have their skincare routine, they have their workout routine. I think in general, we as humans are just innate with nature in terms of our routine, right? We think about when we go travel and we are out of our routine. Sometimes we feel flustered, sometimes we feel off balance. And I think getting back into our routine makes us feel more level headed. At least that's how I think about, my routine. And so I think it's really kind of this consumer psychology that Elliot knew from, his university experience, that he realized, hey, I need to tie in a routine driven approach here in order to drive stickiness and retention, with my brand. And so, I think it's really a unique approach that he took here. And if we look at the successful skincare brands that we've covered on this season, a lot of them really emphasize routine.
I think you're absolutely right. Like Glow Recipe, which was, the last episode we did, they embraced the long routine. They wanted the 10-step process. Whereas, Row, they're like, no, give me 2 things. And so I think that you're onto something here, where these simple frameworks inherently take a very complicated process, something that requires an enormous amount of research. I mean, Elliot I could just imagine him in the library going through these journals and, reading the same thing over again and maybe making a slight, inference between one thing and another thing. And being able to take in all this information and distill it down into really understandable bite-sized pieces is, I think, really the value of these frameworks. And I think what's also important is that if you are the one who's doing the distilling, you are inherently building trust with the person who's listening to you, right? You're trusting that they did their research. You're trusting that they knew how to look at these things. And so you're allowing consumers to help shortcut this knowledge as opposed to them doing it themselves. And so I think that that's just a really interesting piece here. Is there's so many things that you can look to, and whenever you create a product, you can always go in and talk about how complicated it is, all these things that are really difficult. But being able to say very simply, this is what it is, and this is what it's for, and this is why it's important, is really an art more than a skill.
Yeah, and I think what's really unique about the Medik8 story is probably people are wondering, well, how did he go to market, right? And there's obviously tons of people that build great products but don't build strong businesses because they don't have distribution, right? And so they actually took a very unique approach that we hadn't seen on this season yet, and they sold through professional channels. By that, I mean medispas, dermatology clinics, and skincare therapists. So they went directly to these professionals and really partnered with them as a distribution channel, which I thought was, really smart because they took a scientific approach with their development, right? And I think targeting these professionals had 2 advantages. Number one, they could validate and prescribe Medik8's science-backed offering and their formula. And it was really this stamp of trust for them. And then they served as influencers in their own right, like almost micro influencers, if you think about it, recommending their products directly to clients, that were seeking these visible results. So I think it was super smart of him to really, lean into this professional channel approach.
Yeah, like you said, we haven't really talked much about professional channels on this season so far, but it's very unique to skincare. And so let's dive into a little bit more. When you say professional channels, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so typically it means products sold through licensed professionals, not general retailers. This could be dermatology clinics, which are like medical offices. I'm sure most people listening have been to a dermatologist at some point in their life. Could be medispas or these aesthetic clinics that are kind of facilities that offer, Botox or facials with a strong retail component. But, products in general sold alongside these services. Could be day spas and beauty clinics that are more treatment focused, like facials or peels. And it could be, skincare therapists that are licensed individuals to do these, facials or skin health services. And it's funny, to be honest, for me, though it's not a professional channel, being in Utah, when I think about a professional channel, you've got to know what comes to mind for me. It's the MLMs, right? Because in its own right, you could argue that, these MLM channels where you have, these network marketing approaches are indeed somewhat of a professional channel. Now, obviously they're not licensed, but it is a similar kind of dynamic there.
Yeah, well, actually, my aunt who lives in Utah is an esthetician, so she's got I think one or two locations, and so they're doing a bunch of hair removal. So I was texting her preparing for this episode. So shout out to Anna if you're listening. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Like I think that these channels are completely different than what you'd see in traditional retail or wholesale. And kind of building on what you were saying, I think there's a couple things that really stand out for how to approach the professional channel different from retail, right? Retail, it's about convincing a buyer, it's about having a traffic strategy. For this one, it's more about an education driven sales approach. And so these products need to be recommended by the professionals. So think about your therapist, your dermatologist, those sorts of things. And because this is part of a treatment plan, the credibility is extremely high. And most consumers will not say no to their dermatologist to say, oh yeah, okay, I already spent $150 to do something. I'll spend an extra 50 or $80 because you recommended it goes well with what I need. And so that's an important piece. I think also with the professional channel, you don't have to really be beholden to shelf space. And so if you think about like Sephora or Boots, where most of the other skincare brands are, shelf space is king. And in most of these elements, the trust that a consumer has with therapists is the key thing. And so these guys have a back office worth of product. They don't have to have a whole bunch there. It's just kind of what's there. I think that you've also got elements around training and certification where brands most often will have to train these professionals and help them understand what's there and why they should recommend their product over someone else's product. And so you kind of have to train your buyer who's going to make these ultimate recommendations. But the result of doing that is that the professional channel generally has a very high AOV and very high consumer loyalty. And so if you can break into it, if you can convince someone that you've got something really special, something that's really going to help their clients, they're going to endorse it over and over again. And then they just happen to make money on it as well.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, is this a big difference between the US and EU markets, right? Are professional channels bigger over there? I mean, if I were a young brand and I wanted to go into professional channels, how would you navigate this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there is a bit of a Europe versus US dynamic here. In Europe, the professional channel is highly fragmented, and you've got thousands of independent beauty clinics and therapists. And so this is a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it's easier for you to approach people individually because they are empowered to make that decision. But it means it's going to take a little bit longer to roll out, and you may have to go clinic by clinic in order to get there. In the US, it's a little bit more consolidated. You've got some big dermatology and aesthetic chains like Skin Spirit or Ideal Image that you can, close one sale and you're in dozens of locations at any given point in time. There's also a very large universe of independent medical spas and estheticians. But in the US, you're usually going to work with a distributor like a Derm Pro, Universal Companies, or Aesthetic Source. And they are typically the gatekeepers for these new brands in much the same way that UNFI or KeHE are gatekeepers for food companies.
Yeah, and I think, if you're going to launch into professional, you've got to recognize that there's definitely a difference between these channels. Obviously, there's a difference between Americans and Europeans in terms of their preferences. Americans typically buy skincare more direct from their dermatologist or physician, whereas Europeans, really are looking to purchase skincare items from pharmacy chains and beauty retailers. And I mean, I think as I thought about professional channels, there's kind of a few key principles here that I think about, when it comes to winning in this channel. I think you've got to remember your first sale is to the professional. So you need to make sure you're building credibility with other endorsements and clinical studies and unique IP. And I think these kind of unique medical spas are definitely in some sense more open to new products than chains, right? If you're trying to get into a big box, chain, it's going to be a much different approach than a retailer or a chain of medispas. And, really at the end of the day, you've got to convince the professional to carry your product. They've got to believe in your product. And typically, obviously, these are people that are professionals in their craft. They probably have used so many different types of skincare products. It's really got to be tried and tested here. And so, I think it's quite a different approach than selling to a buyer of a retailer, right? Here you're really building credibility and trust with the actual professional in this case.
Yeah, and as you're going through that, it actually resonates even more with me of why CSA is so important, because it's not just for consumers, it's actually also for the dermatologist, right? It's something that's easy for them to understand. It's also something that's easy for them to communicate. And they can, recognize the science, they can go into all that if someone asks them, but it's kind of a no-brainer because it's something that works, like that's been proven. It's easy for them to understand why it works. It's easy for them to explain to their consumer. And so it's kind of a no-brainer at that point. Um, so I think that makes a lot of sense. So talk to me about the economics of the professional channel. So how is it different from D2C or retail, for example?
Yeah, I mean, in some cases it's similar, in some cases it's different, right? In terms of the margin profile, typically you're selling to these medispas or therapists at wholesale, 40 to 50% off MSRP, and then clinics are reselling this at full price, to their customers. So you expect a lower CAC, but a higher kind of B2B CAC because you're going and, really kind of selling these clinics individually unless they're through a larger distributor or network. And so it might be slower to scale, but you get deeper penetration. And I think, these professionals are really kind of in some sense your sales team, right? As they're doing a facial to someone, they might recommend your product as well. And so it's kind of like I think a great way to build trust in those end consumers because your product's being recommended by a professional here. And so, the AOV per account is relatively high because clinics in general will buy per, in bundles. But at the same time, it's a different dynamic compared to going through a retail distribution because you're obviously selling to these professionals. So I think generally speaking, you're going to have better margins than going to retail, but lower margins than D2C, of course. And a professional channel typically is going to scale the slowest, just given that you're going clinic by clinic, and there's not these huge kind of retail conglomerates of them where you have, a CVS or Walgreens or whatever it may be. You don't have that many stores within these professional channels.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the parallels here between D2C and professional, because what you're saying is that the D2C margin is probably higher, but you're also paying a higher CAC. And that's a difficult thing so you probably maybe a little bit better off in professional, I guess would be the assumption. You also have the situation where the professional margins are lower, but your influencer is actually the dermatologist. And so you're not running an Instagram. You're really just like thinking about building these relationships with these dermatologists, listening to them, giving them feedback, and providing them the science or the talking points to help sell the product as opposed to your competitors' products. And when it comes to professionals and getting started, is this a good strategy for like a long-term play, or is this something where people need to start out in professional channel because it's a lower barrier if you're going one by one, but then you want to get out of it as quickly as you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of an early marketing channel, right? Because word of mouth from med spas and clinics are really so high. And in Medik8's, example here, it really became their early marketing engine. And so, you look at the professional therapists and pharmacist partners that they had, and this was really kind of the original influencers that continued to recommend and support the brand even 15 years later. And so I think it was kind of considered their early marketing, early influencer channel, which, obviously paid dividends for them.
Yeah, you would imagine if this was such a revolutionary idea that would just taken off like wildfire. Is that what happened here with Medik8?
Not at all. I mean, they really grew very slowly and in a modest manner. I mean, initially they only sold through clinics and med spas around London and the UK. And, they still kind of were focused exclusively on these med spas and dermatology clinics. And the goal was really to build credibility first. And as we mentioned, this professional channel is a slow roll and definitely reflects in the growth of Medik8 here. So, I mean, doing this, you've got to wonder, what does their supply chain look like? Were they still producing in Elliot's father's shed, or did they, use a co-manufacturer here?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think they were in the shed for a while, from what I could tell. Elliot brought his brother Daniel into the business as the chief product officer, and they built out a world-class R&D team. And so they really made the decision early on to manufacture things themselves. And this worked out pretty well because they had really tight controls over what they needed. They didn't need a huge shot of capacity because by growing slowly and intentionally, they knew that if I add another medispa, that's going to be an incremental however many liters a week. And so I just kind of build as we go through there. And they did pretty well for what's basically a homegrown business. They grew from about 6.9 million pounds in 2014 to about 19 million pounds by 2020, basically more than doubling in those 6 years. And the gross margins were around 62 to 72% is what I would expect, with the profit margin around 17 to 23%. And all of these indicators were looking like they had strong product market fit. And the professional channel was resonating. Again, they were exclusive to the professional channel for the most part. And so they looked at this and said, okay, let's do more. Let's get into other European markets. And eventually they started to branch out into pharmacy chains, especially retailers like Hertz and Space NK and Sephora. And they started to position a little bit into this professional prestige retail type of thing. And eventually they added a D2C store, which opened up their market. But by 2021, they got to a point where they were 29.3 million pounds, which was a 55% year over year growth from 2020, which I thought was pretty great. So I like these stories where it's not an overnight success. It's something where they were building slowly, intentionally, and then it looked like it took off. But it was really all that foundational work that they built and that credibility they built in the professional network.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you got to think 12 years in, it's a relatively modest business. It's still growing, but it's, not hitting that crazy growth curve that we've seen in some other businesses we've covered here. What was kind of the spark that led to their growth then?
Yeah, so a lot of it can be pointed to the pandemic, but I think a bigger element is pointing to a decision they made in 2021 to partner with a private equity firm. And so they recognized that they had some good growth going on, but they needed more dry powder to expand in a meaningful way, and in particular, expanding into the US, because again, they were just Europe at this point. And so Medik8 had a lot of good things going for it. It was profitable, it was growing, and they recognized that they could keep doing this forever and they could get to where they wanted to go eventually. But by bringing on a partner with the resources and the operational expertise, they could grow much, much faster. And so they chose to partner with a firm called Inflexion, who took a controlling stake, which controlling stake is probably like 60 to 70%. They had that deal in 2021. And this firm is really known for taking niche premium UK brands and globalizing them. And so they had a good track record. They had the financing available. And so they looked at this. And so what was interesting was that this wasn't a complete buyout. This was more of a partnership capital model, is how Inflexion would call it. And so it's really designed around founder-led businesses that want the growth capital without fully selling out. And so this is the structure they used. And so the deal valuation wasn't published, but it's likely that it was around 150 to 200 million. Deal size. That would be about a 7 to 10x multiple on where they were, which is in line with what these other brands would see at that point in time. And so Daniel and Elliot were able to retain a pretty sizable minority so that they could be heavily involved in the brand and sharing that upside.
Yeah, and you've got to wonder, why didn't they just go raise venture capital, right? Why did they go the private equity route? And to me, as I thought about this, there's kind of a couple of reasons why. I think number one, they weren't a scale at all cost type of business. They were already profitable. They were manufacturing in-house. They're very science-led here. And so they needed kind of more operational help. And I think this kind of international expansion help rather than, risk capital. And I think there was kind of some key things that they wanted to operationalize better. And I think a private equity firm that is, taking a controlling stake is going to come in, put in their people, put in their process and systems, and let the founders still guide them in terms of the brand direction and where they think the market is heading. But really, this type of PE firm comes in and really puts those systems in place that enable you to scale. And so this PE firm really enabled them to upgrade their business. They tripled headcount, they expanded their manufacturing capacity, and they really built a stronger digital presence here. And so this meant by the time that they did sell, they were much bigger and a more attractive asset. And so, they could have, of course, also looked at selling to a strategic buyer, go sell 100% of the business at the time, but that would have capped their upside here. And I think by partnering with Inflexion, there was a much bigger opportunity and also enabled them to take some risk off the table.
Yeah. Well, so how did this PE firm do?
Yeah, I mean, so number one, the first thing they did was professionalize their leadership. Elliot stepped back from day-to-day operations in about October 2022 and joined the board as a non-executive director. And they made a big hire here. So in July 23, Medik8 named Simon Cobble, who was the former CEO of Face Gym, as well as MD Europe and North America at the Body Shop. And so this guy has a really impressive track record. They also built out a really, 100,000 square foot innovation center and,
Wow.
really built out more robust infrastructure to scale. And I thought one unique point of what they did is it was a net zero construction practice. So solar roof, major water reduction plans, EV charging, and it was a sizable step up from their existing R&D and manufacturing capacity. So this enabled them to double their factory capacity, really do everything when it came to in-house formulation. They really leaned into sustainable packaging, and they kind of had this B Corp style accountability across their supply chain. And so they really invested in growth here and aggressively expanded into digital. So their D2C, they mentioned, grew sixfold, which implies significant upgrades to their e-commerce systems and performance marketing processes. And I think Inflection saw a lot of potential in the US. And so they boosted the D2C presence and efforts in America quite a bit. And this in turn boosted the American revenue share sevenfold. So, you can imagine this PE coming in and really just putting their systems into place to expand into America. And that's really what they did. And the outcomes here, I think, really, speak for themselves. I mean, by 2023, 2024, the business was described truly as multi-channel. They had their professional channel still, they had pharmacies, they had great retail partners, and they had a strong D2C business. Revenues increased to about 45 million pounds in 2023 with an estimated EBITDA about 15.6 million pounds. And the US sales really tripled during this time. And then sales increased again by 50% in 2024 to an estimate of 65 to 75 million. And they're expected to be over 100 million pounds in 2025. So, I mean, really, you talk about bringing in a PE partner that knows the playbook. I mean, this is really it right here.
Yeah, I mean, like, sign me up, right? Like, if you could replicate this over and over again, why wouldn't you do this? I want to talk a little bit about European brands expanding into the US. And I was kind of having this question is, do you think that it's easier for European brands to come to the US or for US brands to go to Europe?
I mean, I think there's different ways to look at it, right? There's probably the regulatory side. I think in general, the EU has more strict regulation than America in terms of skincare. So I think that's one side of it. I think in terms of marketing, I think Americans are more kind of aspirational to Europe. And so I think that's another dynamic there. I mean, how do you look at it?
It's a good question. I think, on one hand, it is a lot more competitive in the US market. And so, I've got brands that we've talked to that they're just thrilled with how low the CACs are in the UK or Germany or France compared to what they're used to paying in the US. So I guess that's a plus. Like, if you can make D2C work in the US, you can probably make it work in Europe. But I think for skincare specifically, I think they have an edge because so much of what trips up US skincare companies is just the regulatory burden. It's the fact that they have to reformulate it and change things. It may not be exactly the way it is, but if you're a European brand that's already grown up in that high regulatory burden, then the US regulations are kind of a cakewalk. And so it is much easier for them to come in from a product perspective. And so I know I would give the edge more toward European brands coming into the US because they've had to go through and prove themselves a little bit more in what I would say is a more difficult environment, even though D2C is more competitive in the US.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what Medik8 did, and this caught the eye of L'Oreal in 2025. They actually got acquired by L'Oreal, and I mean it's a pretty incredible story in itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. So L'Oreal agreed to acquire a majority stake of Medik8 in June of 2025. So just a couple of weeks ago, really. And the transaction value was reported to be about €1 billion. So that'd be about $1.1 billion. And based on 2024 sales, that works out to be roughly a 13x multiple. which is really good for the ecosystem. People are excited to see that kind of multiple again. And if you look at 2025 sales projection, if you project those forward, it's about a 9x forward sales. So the answer is probably, we're probably around 9 or 10 for where things are. But this is a really good space from a multiple point of view for high growth dermocosmetic brands. And I thought what was interesting is that Inflexion retains a minority stake with L'Oreal. And L'Oreal has the option to purchase it at a later date. And so even now, the PE firm is not choosing to exit out. It's something where they're looking to, hang on to it for a little bit more because they think there's more upside there.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite the deal. I feel like when I looked at the acquisition, it seems like, the return was pretty incredible in terms of timeline here, right? I mean, Inflexion probably put in like 90 to 140 million for a majority of the equity at a 150 to 200 million dollar valuation, and sold it in a pretty short timeline. I mean, they still own this minority stake that hopefully will return even more. But I think in this short timeline, they probably return like a 4 to 6x on their investment, which is pretty amazing by anyone's standards.
Yeah, I think you're right. Why do you think that L'Oreal was excited about this deal?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, right? Because if you look at skincare acquisitions in the past and what's kind of gone on here, I think there's kind of these playbooks that these major skincare conglomerates really put into place, right? And so I think, L'Oreal saw Medik8 had expanded and done well in the US. I think they probably saw more opportunity to grow here in the States, but I think they also probably saw the opportunity to grow even more internationally and in other markets as well. And so that's kind of what caught my eye. I think it also really, helps emphasize L'Oreal's Luxe division, which is kind of bolstering its science for its skincare portfolio. And so this was kind of, I think, this white space that they were filling between mass and clinical prestige. And, I think Medik8 offers this clinical approach at a more accessible price point. And the acquisition really enhances L'Oreal's foothold in the dermocosmetics category, working alongside their established brands like CeraVe, Vichy, SkinCeuticals. But, it's a very unique, I think, acquisition and fits their portfolio well. And all in, the deal was very attractive to L'Oreal. Do you kind of want to talk about some of the deal dynamics?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this, and these are just reported figures, but Medik8 had a roughly 34% gross margin, which is a very strong premium positioning. And L'Oreal's actually average gross margin is only 26%. And so this is accretive. It's not every day that a company can acquire something that's this fast growing, that is this margin accretive. Usually it's going to be a little bit dilutive, if not, about where it is. And I think that under L'Oreal's global network, Medik8's projected sales of about 115 million this year could accelerate even further. L'Oreal can take them into the Middle East. They can take them into Asia. And they probably saw an opportunity for further cost savings through combined R&D infrastructure, supply chain, shared distribution, things like that. And I think what's really interesting is, unlike other rapid influencer-backed exits, Medik8 followed a very grounded path. It was over a decade of brand building where not a whole lot was happening relatively, and now they've culminated in this profitable exit. And so this really helps align L'Oreal's strategic acquisitions over time, whether it be SkinCeuticals, CeraVe, Skin Better. And so I think there's a really good opportunity here for L'Oreal to make good on this investment.
Yeah, and I mean, where do you think L'Oreal is going to find scale in Medik8, right? Is it, just really around optimizing their supply chain or distribution? Is it leaning into these professional channels? I mean, where do you think the scale is going to come from here?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly had to believe something for them to pay £1 billion for it. I think that the opportunity here is pretty massive. Clinical skincare and dermocosmetics in general is the fastest growing premium segment. It's growing about 8 to 10% a year globally. So let's just think about that. If you do nothing else, this thing should grow about 10% a year indefinitely. If you lean into CSA, if you keep doing more, you can do even better than that. L'Oreal has a strong track record of scaling other brands like this that they've purchased. Look at CeraVe, which is a $1 billion brand. And so L'Oreal kind of knows what to do with this case. And there's still so much global expansion potential. The US is still relatively untapped. L'Oreal's got 100 other countries they can roll this out to. And I think that, it's really important. I keep talking about CeraVe, but they were $100 million brand when they were acquired. And now I think they're over $2 billion in just under a decade. And so there's a lot here. And I think they see Medik8 as the next CeraVe, which could do really well over the next 7 to 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it'll probably become a billion-dollar brand within, the next decade. Pretty incredible playbook that L'Oreal has, that's for sure. As I think about this episode, there's so much to learn here from Medik8, right? Number one, we talk about digging deep into a unique professional sales channel like they did here. Number two, we talked about a European-based brand expanding into the US. And number three, we talked about partnering with a PE firm instead of a VC and really, growing through their systems and their playbook. And so, I mean, those are kind of the three things that stuck out to me in terms of biggest lessons from this episode. I feel like so many e-commerce brands in today's world are tied up into, typical sales channels of, Shopify and Amazon and retail. And, I think right now we've seen some incredible brands grow super fast through TikTok Shop. And I think there's always this kind of unique dynamic of channels that are underutilized and under, tapped into for that matter. And, it's something to think about as a founder in terms of, hey, when everyone's going left, should you go right and explore this, new unique channel? Because, you and I both know the brands that were very early on TikTok Shop. And I think even today, it's relatively still early, are now, really established on there and growing and pushing great volume on there. And so I think, to me, this makes me think when there is a unique or new sales channel to explore, put those resources into it and take a stab at it. Really, understand, okay, is this something that can, really grow with my brand?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think what you're sharing really resonates with me as well. I think some other things I took away from this episode was, one, find a framework, right? CSA is simple. It's brilliant. If you were listening to this, you didn't know anything about skincare, you now know CSA, and that's probably going to be good for, for the rest of your life. So that's the first one, is make sure you can find a framework that can clearly communicate what it is you do and why you do it. I think the other part too that I thought was really refreshing was that this was a 10-year overnight success, right? They started in 2009. I'm sure there were points where they're like, hey, yeah, we made $1 million this year. Our costs were $900K. Like, do we still want to do this? But they kept at it. They were okay with building a long, enduring brand versus optimizing for an overnight success. And so that takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of fortitude to make sure that you're profitable, to make sure that you can stick with it. And so I thought that was a refreshing piece. And then I love this example, this case study of when it makes sense to partner with a PE firm as opposed to a VC. And I think for me, it came down as, do you need risk capital or do you need operational expertise? Do you need someone to come in and help you run it? And so those things were really impactful for me.
Yeah, I agree. This was an incredible episode. Great story. Medik8, I'm going to remember that routine, CSA. And what an amazing episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify is. But leave us a review, share with a friend, and let Aaron and I know on LinkedIn or Twitter what you thought of this episode. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time on E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA.